Hello guys, welcome back to another tutorial. Hit the bell icon button so that you don't miss out any tutorial.
Social networks are all the fad these days. If you work in the freelance development world, it's not uncommon for you to see a job of work advertised asking for you to make a clone of Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook. The future of social media is going to be less and less towards big, huge media sites, which try to be everything for everyone, and more towards specialized niches which appeal to close communities like gaming and sports. Essentially, a simple social network is a user system which is combined with data structures that manage connections, friends, followers, etc., as well as managing messages and feeds between these connections. This present project is going to use a MERN stack application to implement a simple social media application. We'll also be investigating the use of arrays within MongoDB documents. We'll do this by using the add to set array update operator. MongoDB aggregation operators such as lookup, project, match, unwind, comment, and group are also going to be elucidated and illustrated. So as to provide for keyword searching, the concept of engrams will be introduced here and integrated into the features of this application. As we did in our previous application project, where we implemented a user management system, we are again going to use Express.js. To our previous project's Express.js, we'll be adding services for working with feeds, followers, messages, people, and keywords. Also, we'll be adding routes to the original API, and these will allow access to the feeds, followers, messages, and people. For the React.js portion of the application, we'll be introducing new services beyond our first project, and in the form of feed, follower, message, and people services. New React components will be added to be used for listing followers and people, but we'll also be modifying the old components for use in adding feed listings. The project repository does not change much from the previous one in this project. However, let's go through the high-level changes and what they are intended to provide to this application. In the package JSON, only one new module is being added, engram. In the server services subfolder, feed service, follower service, keyword service, message service, and people service are being added to the project. The feed service helps with the storage and retrieval of messages that are displayed on the walls of users. Follower service helps with the storage and retrieval of users and their affiliations to other users. Keyword service is a simple little class that is used to help in creating engrams. Very soon, and in a separate lesson, we'll be explaining engrams and how they are used in this application. Message service assists in the storage and retrieval of messages being sent from and to users of the application. The people service serves only to help in searching for people, users, in the system by leveraging the keyword system we'll be building. Similarly, the Server Routes API has added to its feed, follower, message, and people routes, all which connect the services described above to external browser clients. In Client App subfolder, we can see under React App components the addition of follower box and navbar components. Navbar is one of those updates that needs to be implemented in the user management system. In contrast to the previous project, we'll now populate the app CSS file with CSS. The other components which are to be added to the components folder are follower page and people page. We'll dig further into these new features in the upcoming lessons. We described briefly in our introduction the new services to be introduced in this application. This lesson will be focusing on each of the services in Server Services directory one by one. First, let's take a quick peek at what has changed in the user service. In Create User method, we see the addition of 3 fields: profile picture, followers, and keywords. Profile picture, sensibly enough, holds the profile picture of the user. Note, pay attention to the contents of the profile picture that begins with data, image, PNG, base 64, followed by a string of base 64 encoded binary. What's going on here is that I've encoded a default picture. This is a cute way of deploying an image without having to keep track of a file for that image. Browsers accept HTML image tags encoded using the data image PNG base 64 as a prefix instead of a path to a file. Followers is an array that will hold each ID of the other user accounts who a user is following. Keywords is another array which will contain engrams of the user's full name. So what's an engram? In computational linguistics, an engram is a contiguous sequence of n items from a given sample of text. Using Latin numeral prefixes, an engram of size 1 is referred to as a unigram, size 2 as a bigram, or less commonly a digram. Size 3 is a trigram. Alternatively, English cardinal numbers are sometimes used, for example, 4-gram, 5-gram, and so on. Note, engrams can be made from things other than text, but we're not talking about those today. Note, a monogram is an image made by overlapping or combining 2 or more letters to form one symbol. Monograms are often made by combining the initials of an individual or a company and are commonly used as recognizable symbols or logos. So in our case, monograms have nothing to do with what we're talking about. In our present case, we are storing the pieces of the full name of the user in order to provide a simplified partial match search. We'll be covering this simple partial match search in more detail as we progress through this review of the new services in the social networking application. Now, these new fields having been explained, let's go to the follower service module, since this module does not depend on any of the other new service modules. What's new here is the use of some MongoDB array operations and their use in aggregation. Let's first look at the array operations, then we'll take a longer look at their use in aggregations. The first item we need to point out is in the add follower method. This is add to set modifier on the MongoDB update method. Add to set modifier to the update method adds a user ID unless the given array field, you'll recall that followers field is an array, already contains the given user ID. Essentially, this add to set means add with no duplicates. Note, if the push modifier to update method had been used, it would have added the given object to the array whether or not the object existed. Essentially, push means add anything. Next, let's look at the remove follower method. Inside remove follower method, we find the pull modifier being used in the MongoDB update method. Pull modifier removes from the followers array all instances of the specified user ID, taking them from the user record specified by follower ID. Remember, since we have used add to set to add any user once only to the followers array, that user will be found only once in the followers array. Now for fetch followers method. Before we can discuss fetch followers method, we need to talk for a while about the concept of aggregation and aggregation in MongoDB in particular. Let's begin here with thinking about the usual processes for retrieving documents in MongoDB. The find operation is probably the most often used for fetching data in MongoDB. You should be aware that you will often find yourself with work entailing writing code for fetching documents containing further embedded documents in a given field. When fetching embedded documents, the find operation will fetch from the main document collection, and any codes you use on it will need to filter its data from its embedded documents. You then need to select a field or fields matching with all the embedded documents, and then scan through them to get matches that match your criteria. Since there is no shorter way to do this, you will be forced to use recurring looping operations to go through all these embedded documents for you to get the ones matching the criteria you need. This is fine if you have a few documents, but when you have a million embedded documents, the process will exhaust server memory and the process doing the work will get terminated before fetching all of the matching documents. The answer to the problem of handling large numbers of documents is to group documents by use of systematic reduction of their number. This is done by identifying within each document its unique contents and by discarding documents not wanted. It's a basic filtration method of producing ever more condensed and valid subsets from the original document set until you reach your goal. Such a strategy for handling analysis of large numbers of documents is referred to as an aggregation framework. Aggregation operators are more difficult to understand than simpler find queries and will generally run slower. However, they are powerful and comprise an invaluable option for complex search operations. An aggregation framework is an operational process which manipulates documents in stages, each stage processing the documents in accordance with pre-selected criteria, and each stage returning computed results. Values from sets and subsets of multiple documents are grouped together, and on these values, more procedural operations are able to be performed for returning cumulative matching results. Aggregations are used to apply a sequence of query operations to the variety of documents in a collection, thus reducing and transforming the document's collective diverse complexity. By using aggregation operators, we can perform queries that offer functionality acting similarly to the behaviors we might expect to see in a traditional relational database query. I shall be referring to this aggregation procedure as being a pipeline. The MongoDB aggregation pipeline is composed of stages and operators. The stages that we are concerned about in the current module are lookup, match, and project. Note, we are not concerned at the moment with operators, but to elaborate a little, operators can be divided into expressions and accumulators. Accumulators can further be divided into accumulators that apply to the group and project stages. But now for the first stage, lookup. Lookup stage performs what is referred to in the relational database world as a left outer join. This is a join to another collection in the same database. This is done to be able to filter in documents for processing from the joined collection. Going back to the code in follower service, we see that this is the first stage being fed to our query in the fetch followers method. The lookup stage specifies that the user's collection from field is to be the source of documents. This source needs to be looked up by using the contents of the followers array field, local field of the current collection. This collection happens to also be users collection. This current users collection then is to be used as the matching criteria to the ID field, foreign field of the users collection, which is the from field. Match is our second stage. This stage filters the document stream to allow only matching documents to pass unmodified onto the next stage of the pipeline. Match uses standard MongoDB queries. For each input document, match outputs either one document, a match, or 0 documents, no match. In fetch followers method, the match stage matches with the ID field of the user to pick out the document associated with the current user's ID. The third stage is project. This stage creates a document situated out of the stream, for instance, by adding new fields or removing existing fields, and then outputting one modified document for each input document. In fetch followers method, the project stage creates a document containing the ID, full name, and profile picture fields for each entry in the followers array. Let's move on to the feed service and get expanding our application of aggregation a little more. The methods which are of interest to us as far as aggregation is concerned are the fetch user fields and the fetch wall fields methods. These methods are a little long, so let's cover them in our next lesson. In our earlier lesson, we ended by introducing the feed service, fetch user feeds, and fetch wall feeds methods. We spoke of their use of the MongoDB aggregation framework. In addition, in this earlier lesson, I proposed covering some of the additional stages to the aggregation pipeline, these being unwind and group stages. So here it is. From the input documents, unwind deconstructs an array field, and by it doing so, the output is one document for each element. Each output document comprises the equivalent input document modified so that it has the value of the array field replaced by the element. In the context of feed service, both the methods we're looking at use unwind. Use of unwind plucks out of the feeds collection the comments field for each specific user ID of each feed. The group stage groups documents by use of a pre-specified expression and outputs to the next stage discrete documents, one each by its distinct grouping. The output documents contain an ID field which contains the distinct group by a set of key values. The output documents are able also to contain computed fields which hold the values of any nominated accumulator expression. These values are grouped by the ID field of the group, but not in any particular order. In this context, group uses a couple accumulator operators to organize the comments according to contributors to feeds. The first accumulator operator returns a value it gets from the first document for each group. Order is only retained when the documents are already in a defined order. In the fetch user feeds and fetch wall feeds methods, the first accumulator operator is used to return the initial values from the user, feed, and created date fields. The next accumulator operator, array element at, returns an element situated at the specified array index, this case the 0th or first element. In the fetch user feeds and fetch wall feeds methods, array element at accumulator operator returns, in an array of associated comments for a feed, the initial user who submitted a comment. Now that we have introduced these stages and accumulation operators, let's look both at fetch user feeds and fetch wall feeds methods and how they use their aggregate pipelines. The aggregate pipeline is long enough in the fetch user feeds and fetch wall feeds methods that it's going to be helpful if we step through the entire pipeline step by step. We begin with the feeds collection of documents in fetch user feeds method as it is processed by its aggregate method. Lookup stage is used along with the user ID in the feeds collection to retrieve, that is, join, a full user record. This record matches the ID field in the user's collection. The record returned is a field named user. Project stage is then used. It takes the information from the lookup and combines this information with the feed information and so builds a new record. The new record incorporates the full user record plus the feed, comments, and created date of the document. In the case of fetch wall feeds method, match stage is more complex with its use of OR operation and IN operation. The match stage here is looking for a match with the current user. This match can be had either in the matching user document or in the followers field. Match stage is then used to screen out all users except the current user. Unwind stage extracts the comments from the feed of the user matched. Lookup stage joins the user ID reference found in the comments to the user collection. Group stage is a massive association of the user feed comments from the lookup stage, and it utilizes the first and array lim at operators. Project stage then assimilates the output of group stage into new documents. Each document contains all the relevant data needed to display information about the feeds and comments of the current user. Note, the last little bit of this query is the sort operation. Sort is not part of the aggregation framework. It is a standard MongoDB sort. Now with our adventure into an example of MongoDB aggregation framework in part completed, let's take a side trip into the keyword service. Keyword service uses an external module named engram, which has methods for creating engrams by use of inputted texts. The keyword service is a JavaScript class and has only one method. This is generateKeywords method, which accepts an arbitrary string of text. GenerateKeywords method sanitizes the string text it has accepted by formatting the string text in unicase. That is, only lowercase letters. It then makes a loop having an interval the length of the given text, and then the text is passed through engram module so that it extracts engrams from the portion of the text. The engrams which have been extracted in the loop are collected into a keywords array. This is returned upon the completion of the generateKeywords method. The next service we need to cover is message service. Message service manages the sending and receiving of messages passing between users in the application. The first message is send message. This accepts user IDs from and to, as well as accepting the message text. The next and final method is fetch messages. It is accepting from and to user IDs. You should note that fetch messages method is another example of an aggregation framework. Let's step through the use of aggregation in fetch messages method. Fetch messages method executes an aggregate method on the messages collection. First, a lookup stage is used. It joins the user collection documents to the user to be found in each from field of each message. Then another lookup stage does the equivalent to the to field of each message. After that, we use project stage to organize the documents from users into a new document. The new document neatly displays the full records of each user in to and from fields. Match stage is then used to pick out the users who have matching from and to fields, or else to pick out by way of the match those users who match the to field, and vice versa. Note, the final case required is for having all messages flowing back and forth between pairs of users, no matter which respective to or from field contains the user ID. What matters is that those two users are exchanging messages. Finally, project stage is used one more time. It organizes a new document form which adds a convenience field, is me, and also carries along all the other fields from, to, message, and created date. Note, the isMe field is constructed by way of a very cool conditional logic which allows for the use of if, then, else decision making. Sweet. Finally, let's move to the people service. People service class has a couple of methods in it, and both use aggregation. Fetch all method uses aggregate method on users collection where it grabs all users who are not the user ID specified by the match stage and in the parameter list of the method. Fetch all method then uses project stage to create a new document which consists of the followers field, full name field, and profile picture field of the original user document, but it adds a convenience field, isFollower. IsFollower field uses the parameter passed in fetch all method to indicate whether the user document is followed by the user ID. Now let's look at the search people method. Search people method is fetch all method on steroids. What I mean by this is that not only does it accept a user ID, it also accepts a keyword by which it matches users against keywords as those are stored in each user's document. Now, check out that cool match stage that can match based on keywords. We've reached the end of this review of express services to be found in the social networking application. You should now have a better idea how the MongoDB aggregation framework works and how to use the framework on some moderately complex constructions. Now that we have a very general understanding of how these services are to work, this lesson dives into the new routes to be added to the social networking API. Let's get started with the feed route. The supporting object for this route is the feed service, which we described in the previous lesson. As with our previous application, auth middleware and user middleware serve here to provide authentication and authorization. Note, do remember to look over the API documentation and note each path of the routes. Our first path is the post verb, which uses the API feed post for its path. This path serves to create a comment to a posting on a user's feed. The event handler for this path extracts the user's ID property from the res response object, as well as extracting the comment from the request body comment property. Note, recall that the ID property was added by the middleware to the response object. The batch of information is then fed to the feed service post feed comment method for storage in MongoDB. It is assumed that if this method processes with no errors, that everything is okay. Then the response object sends back a blob of JSON with a success flag set to true. Note that we do commit a bit of a sin in the way we are writing this. We ought first to have checked for the comment being blank and to have induced a thrown exception in that case. At this time, the application will only return false if an exception is thrown, in which case it will return the error message indicating the cause of the exception. Note, in a more comprehensive application, we would add error logging and have the error message translated into one which is friendly to the user and yet does not disclose the technical reason for the exception. But at this place in our lesson, it is a good time to bring up this data on error messages for you, along with giving you an idea about features for the future, such as profanity checks. The last path of this route is API feed fetch, which is a post verb and it is meant for retrieving feeds for the user. The body property of the request object carries a single flag, isWallFeed, which is used to decide whether we should be using feed service fetch wall feeds or feed service fetch user feeds. Note, I've made the decision here to use a post verb, but it might be argued that I should have used a get verb instead. Had I used a get verb, then I would not have had access to the body in my request, and so I would have had to make two separate paths, one for each of the kinds of feed. Both of the two methods I mentioned a moment ago will return arrays of feeds, and also, as in the previous path in this route, success flags are set, but this time we nestle the feeds in a subproperty which I've named data. Note, the data field itself might represent a little bit of overkill on my part, but it does seem a good way to plan ahead for likely changes. Next, let's look at the follower route. Our first path here is API user follower. This is a post verb that is to be used to add a user to another user's list of followers. The route event handler extracts the current user's ID from the response object and then the ID of the current user that is wanting to follow. Note, the following procedure is more a Twitter style one rather than being a Facebook or LinkedIn style follower. The user who is being followed does not need to approve the user following her. The data returned to the requesting browser client is only a JSON, which contains a success flag and a message. The next path is API user follower, which is a delete verb. Its function is to remove a user from your list of users you want to follow. Other than the change in verb, the only thing to note is the follower service remove follower. Note, us using a delete verb is a little risky, but possible. The HTTP specification does not give the delete verb a request body, although some implementations do. The next path, API user follower fetch, uses a post verb to retrieve a user's followers. The form of this event handler is very similar to the previous ones we've covered, except that this one has an addition of a limit parameter to the request body. The limit property is a movement in the correct direction to solve the problem of returning too many records, but records returned need reducing in number further to allow for paging of results. The next route for us to cover is the message route. The first path of the route is API message send, which uses a post verb to send a message to a designated user. The event handler is structured similarly to the event handlers in the other routes. The other path in API message fetch, which uses a post verb to retrieve messages which were sent to the specific user. Nothing too unique here. Note, the post verb needs limits and paging too. The next route we cover is the people route. The first path is a little different from the other paths covered so far. API people path is a get verb used to retrieve all the people users for the DB. The last path for this route is API people search, which is a post verb used to search via a keyword for people, that is, users. The user route we use here has also changed a bit from the previous application. User update path, what is worth pointing out is that the user route now accepts a profile picture. The user route also has a new path, API user fetch, which is a post verb and is used to retrieve a user's record. That covers all the additions to this social networking project's Express.js routes, as well as covering all the new adjustments to the code I have described elsewhere. As I outlined to you in the introduction, there are some new services involved in this social networking application. Let's start at the top of Client App Services directory with the feed service. Note, observe the export constant feed service line. It informs you what methods will be visible outside of the context of this file. Remember, we said that for a browser, variables are by default assigned to the global space, that is, the browser window. But you should note that Node.js variables within the module, that is, in a file, have scope to the module, the file, unless they are explicitly assigned to module exports or preceded by the keyword export. For example, export constant is a named export, and it exports a constant declaration or declarations. What matters here is the export keyword and not the constant keyword. Constant is used to declare only a constant declaration or declarations, whereas export may be applied to constant and some other declarations, such as class or function declarations. Now, let's take a look at the first method to be defined in this module. It is postFeed, and it posts a feed to the current user's account. As the name indicates, a post verb is set up since we're on the browser side in this SPA. Headers are defined to pass the JWT along with a body which has been set up using JSON stringify. Note, JSON stringify only converts double quotes into an escaped double quote, but it does nothing with the tag brackets. This means you are not safe from cross-site scripting or XSS attacks in your code. You will need to add more security, but we won't be covering that today. Now that the feed request is all prepared, fetch method is used, and the JSON return from the request is scooped up into postFeed res variable. Then the JSON is returned to the particular method that called this present method. Typically, I've been making sure that I throw exceptions when a request fails. The next method, postFeedComment, is nearly identical to postFeed, except it accepts an ID for a feed and a comment to be appended to the feed with that ID. The last method for this module is fetchFeeds, which grabs all the feeds for the current user. FetchFeeds method also takes a Boolean flag isWallFeed to distinguish if it will return a wall or a user feed. This method too is very similar to the first method of the module, except in the arguments given and the data returned feeds. Let's move on to the follower service, which helps manage the followers of users. The follower service has three methods we'll cover briefly. They are very similar to all the other methods I've been introducing you to. So I'll cover what they do quickly and point out any interesting features worth noting. The first is addFollower, which simply follows a specified user by adding that specified user's ID to the list of users that a current user is following. The next method is removeFollower method, and like the addFollower method, it accepts a specified follower user ID, but in this case, removes the specified user from the current user's list of followers. Note, remove follower uses a delete verb. The final method in this batch is the fetch followers method. It returns followers up to the specified number of them to be found in the limit variable. Our next item for inspection is the message service module, which aids in the sending and receiving of messages between users. Note, this method is not quite chat, but it is capable of being richly enhanced to support WebSocket-based live chat or else conventional email-style messaging. For the time being, our message service is to contain only two functions, send message and fetch messages. Send message does exactly what its name says. It accepts a user's ID found in the to variable and sends a specified message to that ID. Send message returns the message it has sent upon success. The second function is also named self-evidently being fetch messages. It returns an array of messages. Now let's move on to a module you met with in the previous project, but here it has been renovated considerably for use in our social networking application, and that is modal service. You might recall in the previous application, modal service was responsible for keeping tabs on the open and close options for the modal dialog boxes. There are items of great importance you need to recall now that we are again reviewing this module's file. The first item to recall is the use of the RxJS behavior subject module. It is not only a linchpin for things like dialog boxes, but also RxJS has proliferated now across the entire SPA landscape, both React and Angular. Also, don't forget about the get and set keywords, which we covered in the previous project. In its embellished version, here the modal service module manages 5 dialog boxes: modal, user update modal, user create modal, profile modal, and message modal. Modal could be called just plain modal, and it is used for generic display of information. User update modal and user create modal are pretty much like their old versions in user management. Profile modal is used for the profile page when updating the user's information and picture. Message modal is used within the follower page component to send and receive messages. Other than those items, modal service behaves just like its namesake did in the user management application. We're nearly done with our review of the React service modules and their changes for this social networking application. Let's move on to the final service, People Service. People Service is a very straightforward module. It provides access to data about users on the system by use of two methods, fetchAll and searchPeople. fetchAll fetches all of the users. This method needs paging and limiting added to make it system and user friendly. searchPeople uses the keyword search based on engrams, which we have described elsewhere. That covers all the React services. Let's get going now on our review of the updated React components for the social networking application. This will be part 1 of 2 lessons. We'll start at the Client App Components app folder, and specifically with the app.jsx file, just as we did in our lessons on the user management application. Note, look at the import section where the new page components have been placed. We'll be covering these new components one by one in our review. It is in the render method that things are showing a couple of changes. First, please make a note of the navbar component tag and its use of the and, which is the Boolean and. The Boolean and here is doing what is called short-circuiting. When we are evaluating an and expression in JavaScript, short-circuiting occurs when the first operand is false, and JavaScript automatically short-circuits and does not even look at the second operand. In other words, in a logical AND expression, the first operand must be true before the second operand can even get looked at. In other words, if the current user is not defined, then the navigation bar is not displayed. Now, let's take note of the new private route lines corresponding to followers, profile, and people components. Now, look at the folders underneath the app folder, which contains the follower box, which is used to list followers a user has selected. In the import section, we see a new item imported from MDB React module, MDB Tooltip. We'll be looking at this item in more detail when we are reviewing the render method for this current component. The component didMount method loads exactly 9 followers and adds those to the state of the component. Next, in the render method, we see the map method is used again to fill a set of UL tags, each tag receiving the information about a follower. The use of the MDB tooltip tag is found inside the map method. As you might be aware, tooltips are a convenient aid for presenting supplementary information to your user. Each is a tiny little cloud, and within is a brief text message. A tooltip is triggered to appear by clicking on specified elements or hovering the mouse over them. Tooltips significantly enhance user experience, especially when they are elucidating advanced UI elements, which often require additional explanation. Inside the MDB tooltip is an MDB button which holds a user profile picture. Clicking on the picture loads the full profile of the user. The sibling of the MDB button is a div containing the full name of the follower. The list of followers which we built a few minutes back is included by using the curly brackets to the elements returned by render. Since this project will use quite a number of Bootstrap CSS class names, we will be spending some time discussing these as we encounter them. This current render method provides several CSS class name examples. Call MD4 is indicative of the grid system in Bootstrap, specifically the prefix COL. The letters following the call are used to define at which screen size that class should apply. XS stands for extra small screens, mobile phones. SM stands for small screens, tablets. MD stands for medium screens, which can apply to some desktops. LG stands for large screens, which are the remaining desktops. The numbers at the end of each class name represent a portion of the total width of any div. All div elements are divided into 12 columns. So in our present case, call *4 spans 4 of 12 columns, half of the width. Call *12 spans 12 of 12 columns, the entire width, etc. Panel and panel default are CSS class names used for a basic panel in Bootstrap, which is a bordered box with some padding around its content. Panel heading class adds a heading to the panel. Panel title is a class used inside a panel heading to adjust the styling of the text. It removes margins and adds a font size of 16 pixels. Panel body is a class which provides styling for the content of the panel. Clearfix clears the floated contents of any container. Button and button primary classes are designed to be used with the button element. The anchor element and the input elements can also accept these classes with some additional requirements. Button primary class, along with a whole host of others, button secondary, button success, button info, etc., provides a particular style benefiting a particular use in your application. That covers the basis for the follower box component. Next, let's make mention of the modal and footer components underneath Client App Components app folder. Footer component was actually present in the user management application, but was placed as a sibling in the app component. In this current application, it is placed as a child. It is, however, essentially the same component as before. Modal component was not present in the previous project, but we would learn nothing new by studying it. It's a straightforward implementation of a modal dialog box based on the principles we've already discussed. With those items out of the way, let's go to the next component, which was not present in the last project, at least not as a component, navbar component. Other than items which we've encountered before, the first thing that jumps out at us is a new method, component will unmount method. Component will unmount method is invoked immediately before a component is unmounted and destroyed. It is here that you may perform any necessary cleanup in this method, such as invalidating timers, canceling network requests, or cleaning up any subscriptions that were created in component did mount. Note, component did mount subscribed to an observer for current user object, which is stored in current user sub. In this component, we cancel the subscription to current user sub in component will unmount method. In the render method, we use short circuit method based on the definition of the existence of the current user object. We mentioned earlier to decide if the render will return any elements or no elements. If elements are returned, then those elements contain links to home, people, followers, and profile components, as well as a logout feature. That's all that needs to be said about navbar component. Now, let's move back up the tree of components to the follow page component. Follower page component is where the users go to see the users who have followed them and interact with them via messaging. Starting near the top of the module file, we see the import of the follower box component. Going down the file, we see that the current users list of followers is loaded inside the component didMount method. Next, in the render method, map method is used to take the user's list of followers and populate a div with the information about each follower. Note, in this Bootstrap layout, we are using call MD3 class inside a surrounding div, which is specifying row class. Row classes must be placed within a container, fixed width, or container fluid, full width, for proper alignment and padding. Note, you won't see the container class in this component. These page components are loaded into the app component where we can find the container class. Use row classes to create horizontal groups of columns. Content should be placed within columns, and only columns may be immediate children of row classes. In this current situation, the follower div has 3 columns. The first column contains the profile picture of the follower along with their full name. The second column contains a button for opening a message modal. Note, I'll be covering the message modal component in the next lesson. And the third column contains a link button to the profile of the follower. Note, pay attention to the Bootstrap button block class, which helps with buttons at the block level. Another note, look at the classes FA, FA Envelope, and FA Edit. These are examples of the Font Awesome library. Every developer should be familiar with this fantastic and awesome collection of fonts and icons. That covers all the follower page component features. We still have more components to cover, but we shall be finishing up the React applications components in the next lesson. In the previous lesson, we said we would be reviewing the message modal being used in the follower page. Message modal component is very much like the other modal dialog boxes we have discussed, but let's examine some of the peculiarities of its revised implementation here. In the class constructor, you will see this line. This handle message change equals this handle message change bind this. This line of code can strike fear in the hearts of JavaScript developers, or maybe just confuse them. If you do not understand the concern here, let's first ask, first of all, what is this line of code doing? Or, what is this line of code there for? Let's start from the rear end of the line of code by explaining what bind does. The bind method creates a new function, and when this is called, it has its this keyword set to the provided value, that is, bind this. It also bears a given sequence of arguments preceding any provided at the time the new function was called. Next, notice that handle message change method preceding the bind this is defined a few lines down from the constructor, and that it is also containing a reference to the this keyword. Handle message change method is also used in the render method when a text contents change and when the send button is clicked. You should understand and remember that the this keyword refers to an execution context, and that this means that the value of the this keyword depends on when the line is used. It does not depend upon the line of code it is declared in, that is, not on how it is sequentially placed in your code. In order for the handle message change method to work properly, all the instances of this keyword must be referencing the same execution context. Note, the line of code just explained is recommended in the React documentation as giving you better performance in your application. Performance is the other part of what is going on with this line of code. We could have put the string this handle message change bind this directly in the change and click handlers of the render method, but doing so would have meant that every time the render method was executed, the bind would occur. Binds can be expensive to execute and thus make your application slow. Other than this very interesting feature, we should point out that the render method has a date format method named format_AM_PM. This is used to format the date and time on the messages. Let's turn over our review now to the home page component where everyone lands when they log into the application. In the homepage constructor, we have another of those bind commands, which this time involves the fetch feeds method as well as the handle post change method. Note, fetch feeds is executed in the component did mount, but it is also referenced in the on submit of the format form and also in the click handler of the button with the label post. Both of these instances are inside the render method. The render method contains a set of nested map methods, and these serve to populate the feed items and their comments. Finally, in homepage component, note that there is a follower box component at the bottom of the render method. And with that, we have completed our review of the homepage component. Next up, the people page component, where we go to find people. First, and near the top, notice we have a different MDB React import named MDB call. We'll discuss this item when we get to the render method. The people page component search facility relies on the keywords, engrams, that we have discussed in earlier lessons. These keywords are entered into the text box and the search is triggered by the search button. The MDB call component manages the Bootstrap class names for the Bootstrap grid system columns classes in the render method. Recall we talked about the raw Bootstrap grid system class methods in our last lesson. Note, I've been a little inconsistent in my use of MDB call. There are also corresponding MDB row and MDB container components which could have been used together with the MDB call. As a priority in our first update, let's set the conversion of the markup to pure MDB React. Now, let's move on to our last component, profile page component, whereabouts information on a user is displayed. The only feature we will highlight is the component did update method. Component did update method is invoked immediately after updating has occurred, but this method is not called for the initial render. You might use this opportunity to operate on the DOM when the component has been updated. In this place, it is also good to do network requests, so long as you compare beforehand the current props to the previous props. For example, a network request may not be necessary if the props have not changed. The profile page component did update watches for a change in the user who is being displayed in the profile page. In the event of a change in user, component did mount is executed, refreshing the profile page component's contents. That pretty much covers what's going on in the profile page component. Now, let's look into the profile modal page component, which is situated underneath the profile page component. The profile modal page is a modal very much in the same spirit of implementation as the other modal components we've implemented in this and the previous project. The interesting feature I'd like us to note is the resize image method. Resize image resizes the profile picture to 100 pixels by 100 pixels in size. Note, an HTML canvas element is used to manage the act of resizing the image. Resize image method is called when the profile picture file name changes. Note, inside the render method, is placed a browser file reader class. The file reader is used to upload the file referenced in the profile picture. Using the file reader in this way may cause some page delays if the image is large. The profile picture image is another area we could add future features, such as an interface for cropping the profile picture. And that completes the review of the React Components social networking application. During this second lesson, we've been reviewing the newly added and updated features of the social networking application. In addition, I have been, aiming at least, at building up your understandings systematically and step by step, so that you should have suffered least risk of being left behind. You must note and be aware constantly that these methods and functions, verbs and modules which we have been discussing are in no way limited only to the contents and the uses to which we have put them and which we have described so far. My efforts have been to offer you basic training, some foundational walk before you run stuff. And along the way, I've been aiming to point up to you commonplace pitfalls and some of those places whereat care in general is especially needed, so as for us to be able to proceed always constructively. Having gotten now to the close of these initial two projects, you will have obtained at this point a reasonable grasp of how to make a simple UI and how to set up a basic social networking system. This may seem small beginnings to you, though you will recall that around 2 or 3 days back you were not able to do these things at all. Any sound knowledge, or importantly, any sound practical knowledge, is better to know than not to know. Like that box of hardware bits you have laying around. As soon as you have cleared it out, something you need that has been thrown in the trash comes up as being needed. This is why there's nothing that is not worth knowing, provided that it is true and useful. An important topic we covered has been MongoDB aggregations, which was the natural place to go to regarding social network applications. You will have seen in the initial points I've made concerning aggregation that wherever it is feasible, I am attempting in these lessons to take the hard slog out of the development work for you, when I can see that this is possible. In relation to this general aim of mine, I want to say a few words regarding 1. Workarounds, 2. Temporary fixes, and 3. Taking shortcuts. Workarounds are often temporary fixes, okay for the time being. This is because they are what they say they are, a working solution around a problem arisen. They are by nature unsatisfactory because there is a more elegant way in which the issue ought to have been handled, but the practical world is sometimes stubborn and they are needed. Temporary fixes should not be done with an intent that they become permanent. This is a poor practice and is storing up problems for a later date, and they may well bite you back at some point. Well-written code, well-documented code, spare but efficient, these qualities will allow you to come back later more easily and find and tackle more thoroughly any temporary fixes you might have had to make. Shortcuts in general are bad practice. Sometimes you will find the customer demanding them, and when this happens, you should bow to the customer's desires. Nonetheless, you should always firmly let the customer know that the shortcuts asked for sooner or later will show up as unsatisfactory. Often they cost more to rectify later than an upfront facing of the problems would have cost. Thus, often there is no such thing as a shortcut, in fact. Not shortcuts, nor workarounds, nor temporary fixes are ever elegant. Nor are they what I am offering you here, for instance in my opening points in the lesson on MongoDB aggregations. In my lessons, I am offering you ways of doing development which are characterized by their elegance and not by their contingent expedience in the heat of the moment. What is elegance then? It is a way of working which is good practice. It does the task it is set to do well, or very well, with few, if any, downsides. There is no better way of doing the job in the context of the current solution needed. It requires to be as brief and concise a solution as possible. It is a permanent solution and one that is durable. And so, as for shortcuts, elegant solutions tend to be shorter and concise, but they are solutions which are fittest for purpose in the broadest sense, and this makes them, professionally speaking, every way the most desirable ones. We discussed briefly in Project 2 the new services to be introduced in this social networking application. We looked at user service and at create user method with its 3 fields, profile picture, followers, and keywords, and one by one we discussed and opened their concepts out to you. Remember, the content of profile picture begins with data image PNG base 64 followed by a string of base 64 encoded binary. There were also concepts such as followers and keywords we introduced to you engrams. Do you remember what an engram is? Were you to need a quick, reliable briefing on the answer to this question, ask yourself, how, where, to whom should I go? This conundrum leads to a few general principles. By habit, I keep by me for reference close to hand copies of documents which lay out clearly and simply the basic concepts for the job I'm doing, and their descriptions and their uses. I keep these documents to go back to at times when I am perhaps dealing with new and complex permutations in an application which I have not come across before. Else, when I am called to use a familiar item and I feel I have not handled that item since too long a time. I recommend that you also keep at hand up-to-date reference documents. I also recommend as general good practice that you keep in good order all your previous notes and documentation in the various formats in which you will have it. Use it as your handy reference guide as you go during projects. In this way, nothing is lost or wasted, not even, especially not, personal failures, which are given to you to make use of in constructing better in the future. As for engrams, what are they? In computational linguistics, an engram is a contiguous sequence of n items from a given sample of text. Engrams introduce the concept of an aggregation framework. This concept provides one useful answer to handling large numbers of documents. This is by grouping the documents into a collection and then by elimination and matching to proceed in a systematic reduction of their number. This is done by identifying within each document its unique contents and by discarding documents not wanted. A basic filtration method of producing ever more condensed and valid subsets from the original document set until you reach your goal. In the points of principle I have offered in this conclusion, I have aimed to highlight the gulf existing between good and bad practices. Upon these differences, upon how you approach them, depends heavily your reputation as a professional. In turn, upon this reputation of yours will rest the caliber of works you get asked by clients to create, and also the likely caliber of those works as you actually deliver them to your clients. These things, in turn, will be reflected in the amounts of money you are likely to be able to ask and so earn. On them also will rest heavily the success of any business you might start up or be involved in. But more important, perhaps, is the issue of your personal self-respect and how you want to be able to think of yourself as a person who has aimed consistently at excellence. At some point, you are likely to want to be able to rest assured that in the main you give or have given your best vocation, your best shot. You will want something as tangible as grateful satisfaction to take away with you from your life and work when you retire to sleep each night. In the lessons which have concerned this social networking project, we've been concentrating on dealing with tools that allow connections between people. When dealing with connections between arbitrary entities, be that people, places, things, categories, or other data, we do well to begin by creating what is called a graph. A graph is composed of two elements, a node and a relationship. Each node represents the placing of an entity. When two entities are placed disparately but in the same context, they will have a relationship, one with the other. This relationship represents how the two nodes are associated within that register or context. Relationships are sometimes referred to in graphs by the term edges. Imagine two nodes, say contractor and agency, and they are able to be relational. Agency would have a relationship we can call contracted. In pictorial form, this relationship is normally represented on a flat plane as a pointing line extending from the contractor node to the agency node. Our current social network application is a perfect example of an application where a graph database might well be used. In the illustration below, you are shown a small and discrete portion of a total number of users as nodes represented by a graph database. In the illustration, the nodes, each labeled user, represent one person each. Nodes, and thus persons being users, are interconnected by relationships which are described by how each node connects to other nodes. As we see below, Peter and Matthew follow each other, as do Matthew and Craig, but although Craig follows Peter, Peter doesn't reciprocate. So how exactly do graphs work in the context of databases? Graph databases are different from other DBMS, database management systems. Graph databases put relationships first prior to all other parameters. In the graph database world, connected data is given special consideration in regard to database CRUD operations. This connection's primary approach to data means that relationships and connections persist and are not just temporarily calculated through every part of the data processing lifecycle. This extends from idea to design in a logical model to implementation in a physical model to operation using a query language and persists within a scalable, reliable database system. In all other DBMS type databases, connections between entities always have to be inferred by way of foreign keys, for example, by relational database schemas, or by processing the connection outside of the database transaction, for example, the use of MapReduce. Note, MapReduce is a large-scale data processing platform which is able to be used to analyze the text data and so to build an index of the text. It has a multitude of other applications, especially for big data. The MapReduce algorithm contains two important tasks, namely map and reduce. Map takes a set of data and converts it into another set of data wherein individual elements are broken down into tuples, that is, a key value pair. As a consequence of graph databases not needing to make inferences, their data models are simpler and yet more expressive than the ones you'd produce when using relational databases, or by using no SQL, not only SQL stores. How do graph databases get stored? Some graph databases use native graph storage. This is specifically designed to store and manage graphs. Other storage technologies for graph databases use relational, columnar, or object-oriented databases as their graph storage layer. Non-native storage is often slower than having taken a native approach because all of the graph connections will have to be translated into that different data model in the storage layer you've chosen. How do I work with graphs? Native graph processing, or as it's called, index-free adjacency, is the most efficient means of processing data in a graph. This is because native graph can make the most of the connected nodes physically pointing to each other in the database. Non-native graph processing engines use other means than directly via the nodes in their processing of create, read, update, or delete, CRUD, operations, none of which are optimized for handling connected data. Graph databases are used also in technologies such as recommendation engines, artificial intelligence, master data, knowledge graphs, and fraud detection. How well do graph databases perform? Of necessity, your data volume will definitely be ever increasing as time passes, but what's going to increase at an even faster clip are the connections or relationships between your data nodes. Big data will definitely get bigger, but connected data nodes will grow exponentially against big data's rate of increase. With traditional databases, relationship queries come to a grinding halt as the number and depth of relationships steadily increase. In contrast, graph database performance stays constant even as your data and its nodes grow year over year. How flexible are graph databases? Graph databases allow your IT and data architecture teams consistently and constantly to move at the speed of business. This is because the structure and the schema of a graph data model will flex as the solutions you require in industry are changing and growing. You don't have to model your domain ahead of time exhaustively, and then as likely as not have to remodel and migrate the DB exhaustively when some executive asks for a change. Instead, you can add relationship properties to the existing structure without endangering current functionality. With the graph database model, you have great capacity to modify and enlarge, thus you have assured control. The RDBMS data model, on the other hand, will always be dictating its requirements to you. It may well force you into adopting its tabular way of seeing the world. What are some popular graph databases? While I was a chief architect for an intelligence gathering application, I first encountered a graph database by the name of OrientDB. OrientDB supports graphs natively, not as an afterthought nor bolted on, as the expression goes, as well as documents, key value storage, very fast write times, and its own custom version of SQL modified to support graph operations. Neo4j is a native graph database which is considered to be the most popular in the industry. Does MongoDB support graphs? Of late, many non-graph databases have been keen to incorporate graph compute engines to perform graph database type tasks. Since MongoDB 3.4 release, MongoDB has had the ability to perform simple graph traversal using the graph lookup aggregation stage. Graph lookup stage syntax looks like this. The from parameter is the target collection that the graph lookup stage searches, recursively matching the connect from field to the connect to field. Start with parameter is an expression that identifies the value of the connect from field, which is required to start the recursive search. Optionally, start with may be an array of values, each of which is individually followed throughout the traversal process. Connect from field parameter is the field name whose value graph lookup uses to match recursively against the connect to field of other documents in the collection. If the value is an array, each element of it is individually followed throughout the traversal process. Connect to field parameter represents the field name in documents against which the value of the field specified needs to be matched. That is, in connect from field. The as parameter is the common name of the array field, and it is added to each output document. The array represented by the as parameter contains the documents traversed in the graph lookup stage so as to have reached the document. Documents returned in the as field are returned in any set order. Let's look at the graph lookup stage search process. Input documents flow into the graph lookup stage of an aggregation operation. Graph lookup targets the search to that collection which is designated by the from parameter. The value in the parameter start with defines where search begins in each input document. In other documents, in the from collection, graph lookup matches the start with value defined against the field designated by connect to field. For each matching document, graph lookup takes the value of the connect from field and uses it to check every document in the from collection. The procedure is seeking for matching connect to field values. Each match found has graph lookup add the matching document in the from collection to an array field. This field is uniquely named by the as parameter. This search find name procedure continues recursively until no more matching documents are to be found, or until the operation reaches any recursion depth pre-specified by the use of the max depth parameter. Graph lookup then appends the as field to the input document. Graph lookup then returns the results after having completed its search on all documents inputted. In future versions of this project, we'll be investigating how to transition to graph lookup. How did we handle connections when working on our own social networking application? In our social networking application, we approached the problem of maintaining graphs in the aggregation framework via making use of the lookup stage. This stage was handled simply by us creating what was essentially a foreign key, in the same way that a relational database is capable of. What are the other possible ways of handling connections in MongoDB? The dbref is a convention and is another way of representing a connection between different documents. Structurally speaking, a dbref consists of 3 fields which it wraps up into a single structure. The first field is the ID field, which applies an object ID method to the ID of the document provided. The second field in dbref is a ref which names the source collection. Optionally, the third field, a DB database name, is desirable if the document collection is in a different database. MongoDB drivers will help the user to create a query using the dbref. This will be a query which can only be executed to retrieve the referenced document. For constructing queries, a dbref is essentially only a helper method. Functionally, dbrefs are only meaningful at the client level. That is, there's nothing going on in the server that makes them special. Additionally, nothing marks out the dbref at insert time or when we go to query it. dbref is only a convention used generically for representing a reference to a document, and it is not a data type making a specific reference. dbref references, as I'm about to explain, are just not reliable. If you were to play around with the ordering of the occurrence of field names in a dbref, what happens is that the dbref reference unwraps into a JSON object. This object has the same field names, but is not recognized specifically as a dbref. One does not deliberately, consciously have to break with the field ordering as this is set up in the first place by the driver. This is because the act of marshalling to and from JSON can reorder fields unpredictably. Note, marshalling means taking data in or out of memory so as to structure in a different format. This marshalling behavior is able to break the aggregation pipeline, and likewise any operation which relies on the reference structure remaining consistent. We've looked through graph databases briefly and how to apply the tools associated with them. The chief tools and their main properties, uses, and contributions to the social networking application have been reviewed. Here and there, I have talked about and elaborated a little on alternatives and on new developments in regard to graph databases and their management tools. I hope you will come away from this lesson fueled and fired to go and explore further these areas under your own steam.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you like the video, do give us a thumbs up and share it. Also check out amazing discounts and offers on our premium courses in the description below.